interview with Jack Prophet. It is July 10th, 2002 at his home.
Just like you said, some of the standard questions, a little bit of background information, where you guys are from, where you were born, and what kind of where'd you go to school, and some family background.
Okay. Well, I was born and raised in the state of Iowa. Went to high school in Ottumwa, Iowa. I graduated from high school in 1943 and went into the Navy. That was during World War II, of course, and I went into the Navy, and I was selected for the V-12 program, which was a college training program. And so I went on, entered that in 1943 and continued on in the V-12 program until I got a degree in electrical engineering in early '46. And then I served in the Navy for a few more months after that as an ensign. I got commissioned at that time and served as an ensign until mid-1946. What else do you need?
Okay. What year were you born?
1926.
And you, ma'am?
27.
So, and after the war, did I hear that right? You served in Europe, or?
No, I never got out of the United States really. I was aboard ship in the Atlantic for a few months. We were coming in and out of U.S. ports the whole time. And like I say, I was in college at Iowa State. It's Iowa State University now. It was Iowa State College in those days. And that's where I got my degree from. After the war, immediately after I got out of the Navy, I went back to school at Iowa State with the idea of getting a master's degree. But pretty soon after I got there, I decided that I really wasn't master's degree material and I better start looking for a job. So I did, and in that fall of 1946, graduate engineers were pretty hard to come by because there'd been a big gap in there. Very few were produced. So I had all kinds of opportunity for jobs. In fact, I interviewed 56 different companies that fall.
Wow.
and just to give you an idea, electrical engineers at the time were being offered somewhere between $180 and $200 a month. That was kind of the going rate at that time.
That's pretty good for that time.
So anyway, I didn't find anything. I kept interviewing companies, but I hadn't really gotten excited about any of the opportunities. One company even offered me a job on a pole setting crew. Electrical utility company offered me a job on a pole setting crew, which wasn't too exciting. But anyway.
What did your mother and father do? What did your family do?
Well, my dad at that time was a machinist working for a company in Ottumwa, Iowa. My mother was basically a housewife, although she did work a little bit during the war years.
How did you gravitate towards the electrical engineering field?
Well, when I graduated from high school, I thought I wanted to be a chemical engineer. And so when I got in that Navy V-12 program, they didn't offer chemical engineering. They offered electrical, mechanical, civil, and so forth. And I don't know why. I just decided that my best choice would be an electrical engineer. So anyway, that's what I did. And in that fall of 1946, when I was interviewing, as I said, I didn't get any jobs that really turned me on until one day I saw something on a bulletin board there that said a man from Geophysical Service was going to be there to interview engineers interested in geophysics. And I had never heard the word before. Didn't even know what it was. So I went to the interview to find out what it was. And got kind of excited about it. I interviewed a couple, three more companies in that area, but Geophysical Service, GSI as it was known in those days, made me the best offer, $235 a month.
And that was high money at that time.
Big money, big money. And so I went to work for them in January of '47 in Bowie, Texas.
So you moved from Iowa to Texas for that job.
Right. Well, meantime, at the end of the war, my folks moved from Ottumwa to Amarillo, so that probably had a little bit to do with with my choice at the time. But I didn't stay in Bowie, Texas very long. I was there about 2 months, and then I got transferred to Napoleonville, Louisiana. And I worked around Napoleonville for a little while, and then I got transferred to Houma. I stayed there, that was in 1947, I stayed there until middle of 1949. And meanwhile, I met this lady here, and we got married in 1949. And I told her mother, oh, I'm going to be here for a long time, and 3 months later, we got transferred to Alberta, Canada.
You're moving all over the place.
Yeah, we moved around quite a bit. That was common in those days on geophysical crews. I was, working on field crews. And,
How did you end up working? What was your relation to the oil field work? Did you eventually?
well, we did. We were seismic contractors that we contracted our services to the oil companies and did seismic exploration.
So you never worked directly for the company; you were just a contract worker
Yeah,
for your geophysical company.
Our company was at that time the largest contractor in the business.
Did you stay with
Just
that?
as an interesting side of it, GSI, out of that company GSI that I started with, Texas Instruments grew out of that company. When I went to work for GSI at TI, Texas Instruments was our laboratory, what we called our laboratory and mechanics division. It later became the tail that wagged the dog.
You stayed with GSI for your career?
I stayed there for 35 years. I retired from GSI in 1981. That's when we moved back here. And I started a little consulting business, which I ran for about 15 years. And it was kind of a practice for retirement because it wasn't a full-time thing during that time, or at least not completely full-time.
Okay. In your dealings with the oil companies, can you describe some of the things that you guys did for them? Some of your field work?
Yeah, well, like I say, it was we were doing seismic exploration in the field. And when I first came down here, I worked out in Napoleonville. We were working in the cane fields over there using trucks. And I don't know if you're familiar with seismic operations, but working on land, they'd drill holes and put dynamite in the hole and shoot off the dynamite and record the information that comes back up reflected back up from down inside the earth.
And that's what you can tell what's down there.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you guys do.
And it was pretty crude in those days. I mean, we thought we were pretty good. It was pretty crude. It was much more of an art than a science.
Yeah, we'd just drill holes and put dynamite down there and blast it and measure it.
And you record this at that time. We recorded on this paper records, and then those a geophysicist and a geologist would interpret that in terms of what was happening down underneath the ground.
Sounds like you guys were going around blowing things up. How did the cities and little towns you were going to, how'd they feel about that?
Well, we didn't do much work in inhabited areas in those days. I say not heavily inhabited areas. There has been seismic work done a lot in some pretty big cities, including Los Angeles, since that time. But then it was still relatively new, and there was lots of country to explore. We generally used, like on the land crew, like I was working on them, we generally used the roads and trails that were available and laid out a grid according to that. And we tried to stay away from houses. We had some rules of thumb of how far we had to be away from houses and buildings and that kind of thing.
You ever
We
experienced?
never really had, and you know, these charges were fired 50 to 100 feet below the ground, so it wasn't a big deal as far as shaking things up. And then later on, I worked in the marsh swamp. Went to work in the marsh around Morgan City for a good while, and that was kind of interesting. It's a pretty open marsh down through there. We used some of the very earliest marsh buggies. But, there were some, you probably heard of Higgins and Higgins boats.
Yeah.
Well, Higgins, New Orleans, made some marsh buggies that were being used at the time, and we had a couple of those. They were not very good. We spent as much time working on them as we did working with them. But about that time, a fellow named Jeremy from down in South Louisiana had come out with another much bigger marsh buggy, which was a much better working piece of machinery. We used it quite a lot at that. And then shortly after that, I went to work I worked, I guess about a year and a half over in the Atchafalaya Basin. We were actually backpacking stuff through the swamp over there.
So
We
how
had to
much,
carry everything,
Yeah.
drill stem, instruments, dynamite, everything, backing through the swamp.
and about how much did that weigh?
Well,
the back of a
for one
man.
thing, you had to carry two big batteries, like a car battery, to run the instruments, and those things weighed about 40 pounds apiece. The equipment was pretty heavy. And then in the winter, in the early spring, well, in the spring, when the floods begin to happen up north, that basin, water gets pretty high in the basin. And we'd use pirogues, and we'd get around in pirogues. That made it a lot easier. That was kind of a fun job, because we actually worked a part of that time right where I-10 goes through now. We
Yeah.
were working right in that area around Henderson and what's the little fishing community down below Henderson there?
Cecilia or something?
No, down.
Oh, wait.
I can't think of the name. Anyway, we worked back in there in an area that was, pretty remote at the time. You'd see a few fishermen back in there, and a few commercial fishermen, and a few sports fishermen back in there. But you didn't see many people back in that area. So that was kind of interesting. In fact, I remember reading in the Times-Picayune in the early 1950s, when they first began to survey for I-10. And this article in the Times-Picayune made it sound like those surveyors that did that survey were the first people that had ever set foot in that swamp. We'd been walking that thing a good while before that. Before that happened.
When was that? You were doing your land seismic work. About what time? What time period did you do your work on land mainly?
The early, when we were working in the point, that was early 1947. And then by April 1947, I was working in the marsh and swamp. And later that year, we moved into the Atchafalaya Basin. So the period I'm talking about now is kind of 1947, 48.
Did you ever do any work offshore?
Yeah,
Or
I
you
did.
moved out?
I guess my first job offshore was probably about 1953, although I knew quite a bit about already what work was being done because we had some offshore crews working out of Homa at the time, and I kind of knew what was happening right from the beginning. Not the first seismic work that was done really offshore. I mean, aside from, I'm talking about offshore as opposed to in the shallower bays and sheltered bays and so forth. And it was 1946, and Humble and Mobile and California company at that time, California company, which is now Chevron. Humble's now Exxon. We're working off of Grand Isle at that time. And they had all just started that kind of operation, and they were floundering around really trying to figure out how to work out there. And one of their biggest problems was how to locate the shot points where the cable was and so forth off there. And they did pretty good when they were in close to shore because they would set up surveying towers along the shore and triangulate in and so forth. And that was fairly easy, but after they got a little bit offshore, it got kind of hairy. And they tried all kinds of different things. One of the interesting things they tried was at that time, at the end of World War II, there were a lot of these surplus barrage balloons. They were just relatively small helium-filled balloons. So they had the idea that if they could float those off the mast of the boat out there, they could see it better from the shore and so forth, see it further out. And so they tried that. It worked a little bit, but they had an interesting story about the president of our company was down there. No, he wasn't the president at the time, but anyway, he later was. But he was down there, and they were inflating the first of these balloons off a barge in Grand Isle. They were pumping helium into the thing. I don't know if you've ever seen that done, but you pump air or helium or something into those big old things, and it doesn't look like they're getting much in them until all of a sudden they go poof like that and they start floating up. So anyway, they were pumping away, pumping the helium into this big old balloon laying out on a barge, and didn't look like they were getting any place when all of a sudden it just popped up and started floating away. Well, it turned out nobody had thought to tie it down. Although there was a rope hanging down from the balloon, and so Dr. Peacock, who was the head of the company, was standing right by it, and he reached up and grabbed the rope, and he wound up about 20 feet up in the air before they finally figured out some way to get. I'm not sure how they got him down, but they finally did. That's in my article. You'll read a little bit about that.
Okay.
In the article, so.
That sounds funny.
Those are
Got
some
kind of a
the
shock
funny
out of
things
that,
happened.
didn't you?
But anyway, the offshore work developed pretty fast. They came up with some ways for electronic surveying very, very early in the game. Some World War II equipment was used for that. That enabled them to get further away from shore and get out of line of sight and so forth.
Did you see that developing really quickly, you said?
Yeah, it developed pretty rapidly.
They realized
I think probably by the end of 1947, they were pretty well using all that electronic surveying. A little company called the ONI, Offshore Navigation, started that. They were the first ones to offer that service. It was called Shoran. And incidentally, one of the founders of that was Bob Suggs, who later founded Petroleum Helicopters here in Lafayette.
Bob who
Mm.
down?
Bob
Bob.
Suggs.
Bob Stokes?
Suggs.
Suggs.
S-U-G-G-S.
I've heard the name.
He died a few years ago, but his wife was running that company until about a year ago, I think. Petroleum Helicopters.
We've been trying to talk to somebody over there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You
Not
need
having
to talk
good
to
luck.
I don't know if Frank Lee is still alive or not, but Frank was one of the founders of DHI, and he was also an old geophysicist way back, and he would be a good man. I'm not sure whether he's still alive. He's probably around Lafayette someplace if he is.
Trying to look him up. What was Bob's wife's name?
Ooh, I can't remember.
I think-
You'd have to ask somebody over
Didn't
there.
they honor her just a few years ago?
Well, just really, probably within the last year,
Yeah,
she retired.
she had a big-
She's kind of
Which she's still around.
She's still
Yeah,
around.
they
She'd be
are.
good to talk to
Paper
as
and
well.
so forth.
Give her a
I
shot.
think she was his second wife, and she doesn't go all the way back to the founding of the company, but she would know a lot of people who were involved with that, I'm sure.
We'll try to look her up, and we'll try to talk to Mr. Lee too. But, how much work did you do offshore?
No.
Too much?
I was in and out involved with it, in and out. I guess by the time I had my first real experience offshore in 1953 or so, I was supervising at that time, supervising a crew that was working offshore. I was living at home, and I went out with the crew frequently, and spent quite a bit of time there. Later on, I moved to Shreveport, and we had an offshore crew that was working for a union producing company at the time. Union Producing was headquartered in Shreveport, so I moved up there to be close to our client, and also we had an interpretation office in Shreveport that was interpreting the data that we were getting offshore. And at that time, I made frequent trips offshore too. And I went back to land work for a few years, and then went to California and worked offshore California for about 3.5 years. Different places. Well, actually, offshore the West Coast, we worked all the way from Alaska to Mexico, just about at that time.
Wherever the oil is, right? Wherever the oil is.
Yeah, wherever they even thought it was at the time. I thought it might be. And
What kind of schedule did you work when you were offshore or on land?
mostly we worked, in those days we used to work 10 and 4, or sometimes it would be 8 and 6, depending on how many hours we got in. When I was working in the marsh around Homa, right after we were married, we were working basically, our basic schedule was to work 100, work 100 hours and come in, or 10 days, whichever came first. And, in good weather and in summertime especially, well, we'd get our 100 hours in 7 or 8 days, which was pretty nice.
So you had a few extra days off.
We were working, during that time, I was working actually shallow water, working in the bays, south of Homa and south of Morgan City in that area.
Are you interested in just Louisiana or the
Yeah,
whole picture?
just
Mostly
Louisiana.
Louisiana.
Yes, ma'am.
And then later, I came back to the Gulf Coast. I was a manager of the whole Gulf Coast region for a period of time. Later went to England as a manager of Europe, Africa, and Middle East. And that's when the work was going on in the North Sea and Mediterranean. We had crews working in the North, offshore crews working in the North Sea, Mediterranean, Persian Gulf, off Africa, off Nigeria, off a couple of places in West Africa during that time. And I traveled around, got to see those operations quite a bit. And then I came back to the United States and ran our worldwide marine operations for several years. Responsible for the whole thing. During that time, we had, I don't know, upwards of 20, 25 crews working worldwide at the time, offshore.
You
I
progressive,
had a lot of offshore experience. Most of my experience was offshore.
progressively worked your way up in the
Mhm.
company until retirement. Okay. What, using dynamite and things like that, of course, is kind of dangerous.
It was very dangerous, especially offshore.
What did you ever see? Did you see lots of injuries, or
I never saw, and I was never involved in an accident. I knew about some that happened. Our company was either lucky or good. We never did have any major offshore dynamite accidents. There were some other companies at the time that did. A couple of ships blew up and killed a whole lot of people. That kind of thing that happened. At the height of things there, during the middle 1960s, when I came back to Houston to run the Gulf Coast operations, there was essentially a resurvey of the whole Gulf of Mexico going on at that time. And at one time I had 14 crews working in the Gulf of Mexico, all of them shooting dynamite. And those crews would shoot 500,000 to 600,000 pounds of dynamite a month. Which is a lot of dynamite. And we carried that on a separate, on what we call the shooting boat. It was ammonium nitrate. We used the same stuff they used to blow up the Oklahoma tower over there, which is relatively stable. It's a relatively stable explosive. It's pretty hard to set off. It takes a detonator of some sort to set it off. And so it was relatively safe, but the problem was you had to throw this dynamite overboard, and we used balloons, or what we call turkey bags, which was just a big old plastic bag.
Filled with it.
You took it like that, got a bunch of air in it, wrapped the wire around the bottom, cap wire around the bottom, and that went into the charge, and it floated the charge at a few feet below the surface. And every once in a while, one of those charges either wouldn't go off or it would break loose and get away. And we're just floating out there in mid-ocean. And we had the common practice at that time was to use a air rifle. If that thing got away or started floating away, you'd shoot that turkey bag and try to puncture the turkey bag so it would sink, which worked fairly well. But particularly off Texas, there were currents and stuff in there that started washing those things up on the beaches. And in fact, when I got transferred back to Houston, that was about the first thing that hit me. The state government and the people along the beaches in Texas were up in arms, as you can well imagine. So we had airplanes that we hired planes and had people go out along the beach. You know, you could see these turkey bags. They were big orange things. You could see them for quite a ways away, and try to spot those things, and then we'd get people out there to pick them up. And that was during 1966 and into 1967. And, you know, there were, I guess, I'm going to say 25, 30 crews working in the Gulf of Mexico at that time. And they were all doing more or less the same thing. It was pretty dangerous. It was a pretty hairy operation.
so when you're on land, you're drilling into the ground to put the dynamite, but out in the ocean,
You
just
dump
floating it
throw it
right there.
overboard and suspend it.
And that had the same
Float it out.
effect for you to measure
Right.
what was under.
So it didn't have to touch the actual hard surface of the ocean floor to be able to.
No, as a matter of fact, it worked better if it didn't, and that's why the exploded. In the early days, they just tried throwing them overboard and let it go to the bottom. And that created all kinds of problems. Besides that, it didn't give you good seismic results. And so they learned finally that they could suspend the charge at really not a very deep depth, like 5 or 6 feet, and it would do better. So that's the way things operated from the early 40s through the middle 60s, pretty much, or through the end, just about through the end of the 60s. Well, during 1967, we heard about some people that had invented what was called an air gun. It's a piece of machinery there that uses a compressed air charge and would release that charge, and it would give you enough energy to use it as a seismic source. It had been tried a few years earlier than that without much success, but by '67 they had kind of perfected it, and we tried it the first time in 1967. We tried it first in shallow water in Corpus Christi Bay off Texas, and worked real good. And I said, hey, maybe we got something here. Get rid of dynamite, which was a big thing. And the other thing was, too, those ships, of course, were equipped to work 24 hours a day, but it was either against the law in many places, or it certainly was against good practice to be out there shooting dynamite at night. So our productivity wasn't as good as it should be. So we were very interested in these air guns, and we developed that as a source. And I guess by 1969, we had just about converted all our ships to air gun sources, which was a much safer source. We had, instead of carrying all this dynamite, we had these huge air compressors aboard, 4 or 5 of those big things running.
How exactly would it work? You said you'd shoot it into the water?
You fill these containers, I guess you might call it, specialized containers, with compressed air, and there was a whole, we made a whole array of these things, which gave us a directivity effect too, and then you just suddenly release this air, and it has the same, it creates a bubble, which is the same thing that the dynamite does in the water.
Float it in the water, and then you have to release the air.
Float it in the water, and it was released. Instead of firing the dynamite, we simply just released the air. And
it released all of it. It released all of it at the same
all at
time.
once.
So it was
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was great. It gave at least as good, if not better, seismic results. Cut the cost by 40 or 50% because the big cost was dynamite cost.
Yeah.
And it created, the safety of it was great, and it did not kill fish.
That was the other thing I was going to ask. The dynamite
They did a lot of experiments. We had to convince a lot of people that it didn't kill fish in the early days, and they did a lot of experiments in different places around the world where they put fish in cages and put them around near these air gun sources and whatnot, and really everybody accepted them pretty quickly that, hey, this is a good thing. So in the meantime, there had been other attempts at what we call non-dynamite sources. That's what everybody was looking for, a non-dynamite source. They had used a gas exploder, some for some high-resolution shallow seismic work, and it wasn't very powerful, but it would you had a mixture of acetylene and oxygen, and you fire that, actually set off an explosion to that, which was somewhat better than dynamite, but certainly wasn't any more safe than dynamite, because you carried boatloads of acetylene and oxygen. It was pretty bad too. So it didn't take very long for the air gun to become standard source for the industry, and that's what's still being used today.
How much time on the boats how much time did you spend on the boats out when you went and did seismic work? Was it
In what way? I don't.
Like, did you stay out for a month at a
stay off a
time,
month
or?
Well,
You go out daily.
as time went in the beginning, like I said, they worked a schedule and they would shut down and come in. Well, and that is, they had to say, hey, we got all these boats, we can't do that. So they started staggering crews. One crew would work 10 days, and then the next crew would come on and work 10 days. They would actually overlap some of them. That went on for a long while. In the later years, as ships got bigger and bigger, and they were working further and further offshore and further away from home, they worked continuously. They would come to port and change crews and go, and then in recent years, they've changed crews by helicopters.
okay?
Just keep working continuously.
You didn't mention living on a houseboat, did you?
I'd like to hear that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, well, yeah, and the marsh and swamp work that we did in the early days, we lived on houseboats and shallow water work too. And I think in the very earliest days of the offshore work, we did the same thing. They were using much smaller boats, and they had a houseboat where they used as their headquarters, and a place to sleep, a place to eat, and then went out from there. These houseboats were quarter boats, we call them, which is different from, I guess, a pleasure houseboat. They were pretty big affairs. They slept 40 or 50 people. They had a big kitchen. They were quite comfortable, most of them. We towed them with ordinary, like shrimp boats, or just boats that were available in the area. We always had 2 or 3 of those boats on the crew, and when we wanted to move, we just hooked on the quarter boat and moved out. We had an interesting experience up near Krotz Springs. Highway 190 goes across, there's a bridge at Krotz Springs that goes across there. And we had our houseboat right there, almost underneath the bridge, that we tied up for all of one winter while we were working in the Chaffley Basin around, well, south and east of Krotz Springs, down around by Alabama and there. And anyway, when we got ready to move further south in the basin, down into the area where I was talking about, where I-10 now crosses, it was in the spring, and the river was high. It was really high, and we were in between the highway bridge and the railroad bridge at Krotz Springs, and there was a very strong current going downriver at that time. And that railroad bridge is not very wide when it's open. It's a drawbridge, and when it's open, it's not very wide. In fact, it wasn't much wider than our quarter boat. So anyway, we had this thing all planned out. We were going to have a vessel in front and a vessel behind, and when we let go from the bank, they were going to pull it out, and the vessel behind was sort of going to hold it back. In the meantime, we had a signal to the guy on the bridge, so he would get the bridge open for us. Well, everything would work just fine. We got the signal on the bridge open, and they pulled the thing out into the river and headed toward that bridge, and just about that time, the rope on the boat in the rear broke. And here was this boat in the front trying to go as fast as he could and keep that thing straight. Well, they went through, I was on the houseboat at the time, and they went through that bridge, and I'm telling you, there wasn't 6 inches on either side of the houseboat. How we got through there, I don't know, but we were 4 or 5 miles down the river before we finally got the thing into the bank where we could control it. That was an exciting experience. There were a lot of funny things like that happened.
We didn't move that much, but some of the couples, families, moved like every 6 weeks. some people had children in school, moved very often. Their children seemed to do fine. They kept up. I'm sure they had a lot of help at home. Probably homeschooling before it became popular. And they did all right. But a lot of times you moved with a crew, so it was like moving with a family. And if somebody got sick, you had helped each other. We lived in, well, we didn't do too badly, but some of them lived in poor housing, whatever you could find in it. I have to be, we didn't carry furniture.
I don't know, we lived in pretty poor housing when we were in Canada.
But you just more or less, you took what you could get.
We had
Plus, we went into places that there had not been a lot of oil people and geophysical people there. When we went to Canada, I've forgotten how many crews moved into that little town.
a town about the size of Sunset, and I think there were 9 or 10 seismic crews moved in there all at once. Well, obviously there wasn't much place for them.
And we lived on top of a garage, and we shared the
Ford
bathroom
garage.
with 5 apartments, 1 bathroom. We managed.
Did you have kids at the time?
No, not that.
We
We
moved.
had, our daughter was born there
But we
later on,
moved.
but we moved out of that.
We moved out
Apartment
there
before she
and
was
we
born.
bought a house trailer. We had to come to the United States to get a house trailer. We bought a house, small one, and moved back so we could have privacy, for the baby.
This is when you were moving between Canada and England and the North Sea and all in the 50s, right?
No,
Or
No,
was
from,
that-
I moved to Canada, that was in 49,
Okay.
from
we
Louisiana.
we went to Canada, we went from Houma to Alberta, Canada, and came back to Houma again after that, and we moved to Shreveport. That was all in the 50s, and then in the 60s, we moved to California, back to Houston, to England, and then finally to Dallas, where I wound up my career in the home office in Dallas.
That was a home office. So we knew a lot of people in Dallas because a lot of them eventually moved back to the main office.
We, people always ask me, well, if you retired in Dallas, why did you come to Sunset, Louisiana?
Well, that was my next question.
Okay. Well, we, as I say, we moved around a lot. Alma was from Houma, and we always knew, I think, that we were going to come back to Louisiana when we retired. I loved Louisiana, and she wanted to be closer to family. And so we decided sometime in the 70s, I guess, that we would eventually come back to this general area, and we kind of thought about the Lafayette area as for a number of reasons. Alma wanted to be close to her family, but not too close.
Don't say it.
I figured that if I retired, particularly if I retired early, which I was hoping to do, that I'd want to do some consulting, and that Lafayette would be a good place to head for. And so we started in the 70s. We started looking around for some property around here, and we found this place in about 76 or so, I guess, somewhere around 1976. At the time, I thought it would probably be 10 or 15 years before I did anything with it, but I kept looking for an opportunity to get there quicker because we loved this place down here. And so the opportunity came in 1981, and I took early retirement and came down here and started.
And worked for a company out of New Orleans that had worked for GSI.
Yeah, the consulting work that I did was for companies that were, I didn't intend it that way, but that's the way it worked out. I got involved with companies who were manufacturing equipment for the geophysical industry. And I knew a lot of people in the industry, so I had a lot of management experience and some product development experience, and so I kind of sold my expertise in management, marketing, and product development to these companies. I worked for several different ones around, but The one I stayed with the longest was a little company in New Orleans called Digicourse. They were my client for, I guess, about 14 years. And not the first one, but they were about the second client, and they were absolutely the last one.
And their main product to the
Well,
geophysical industry.
You'll find that in my article. There's quite a bit about that. But they there was a problem of how when you do seismic work offshore, you tow these long streamers, which are cable full of geophones that you tow behind the vessel. And there was always a problem of where was that thing relative to the vessel. You could position the vessel, but you couldn't necessarily position the streamer. We knew it was somewhere out behind the boat, but it might be this way or that way or wherever. And Digicourse had, some people at Digicourse had invented a very small digital compass that would fit inside this streamer. They actually made it for the Navy to begin with. The Navy was using it in submarine arrays. And we found out about it, and we worked with Digicourse to develop it to make it useful in the seismic offshore streamers. And it worked fine. And so when I retired and was looking around for some consulting jobs, I talked to them, and they took me on pretty much right away. Involved with that, because I had been involved with the development of it at GSI prior to that.
Did GSI have an office here in Lafayette?
They did for quite a few years. GSI no longer exists. It was bought out first by Halliburton, and then it was sold to Western Geophysical. And I don't know what's left of it.
They were in the oil center?
Well, at one time they had an office. I mean, way back, probably in the 50s, they had an office in the oil center. I never was in that office. I never worked out of that office. John Utesh and some of those guys were down here. I'm sure they were somewhere in the oil center, but I don't remember.
Yeah.
I don't know where it was at the time.
All this moving around that you did, was this basically where the company sent you where they just needed seismic work, or whatever?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, when I was working on a crew, on the field crew, when you sort of moved with the crew.
Right. And they send them whenever.
You'd work a job. You'd work a job
You
for
went, all right.
a company in one area, and either that oil company would say, "Okay, we'd like you to move somewhere else," which was quite common in those days, or you'd finish up for that client and you'd get a different client
Right.
and move there. Actually, when I moved from Houma to Canada, I had been working for several years under contract to Texaco, and Texaco was starting a new operation, a group of pretty big operations in Canada, and so they hired us to. Actually, went up there and started a new crew, but because I was familiar with Texaco and they were familiar with me, well, they kind of asked for me, and that's where I went. So.
And we were just kids when we went up there.
Yeah, we only been married 3 months.
Because we, didn't think anything of it. Just went. I was 21 and you were 23.
Did you ever consider any other alternatives to this kind of work because of the lifestyle?
Once in a great while, but never very seriously. I guess the biggest thing, we lived in Shreveport for 7.5 years, and our kids had started school there. And, the company wanted to transfer me to California, and that was a very hard move for everybody. And I did do a little looking around then before I went to California. But really, I never thought much about changing companies or certainly I never did think about changing careers.
This is what you wanted to do.
And the association with the people that we knew and that he worked with, I think kept you in the industry
yeah.
and with that particular company.
That was
I
a
think-
different day and time too. I
Yeah.
mean, there was a lot of company loyalty
Yeah,
from
a lot of
employees and from
loyalty
the
on
company
both
to
sides.
employees. It doesn't
Yeah.
exist as
On both
anymore.
sides.
I hear a lot that the work was arduous and kind of hectic sometimes, but the company loyalty and the pay was good.
Pay was good, yeah.
Well,
Hard to beat.
Wasn't always too good. we waited for the check for many, many years, but it was worth it. And I say the association of the people that we worked with and moved around with. And the industry, just as it does today, goes way down. Now, when we went to Canada, it was booming there, but it was beginning to dry up.
Yeah, it was running up in the
You see,
United States.
and the same thing in Shreveport. There was so many houses on the market. That was a big, lot of oil in people there too. So you just, if you wanted to stay in that line of work, you had to move. You had to be willing to move. And we just didn't think
We
that
didn't
we'd
think
ever
much
be
about
in
it.
one place. I mean, it was just sort of in our minds that we were only in a place temporarily, but we were fortunate.
So your
We
willingness,
stayed longer in a lot of places than most people.
your willingness to move kept your job
It's a
security.
mentality.
Yeah.
We didn't think it, we just, I never did like it, but I didn't think anything of it. We just moved.
Did it affect your children when they were growing up, having to move that often?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, our daughter, our son and daughter both went to high school at the American School in London. And our daughter graduated from there. Like she said, it didn't sound so good at the time, but it looks good on her resume now.
Yeah.
But, you know, as adults, they really feel as though it was it
Good
was
experience.
excellent for their growth,
Oh, yeah.
you know.
Yeah, when they look back on it now,
Psychologically.
they think they had pretty.
Oh, yeah, they
pretty
think they had the most
experience.
wonderful childhood, but they weren't the only ones I cried all the way to California. I was so embarrassed. I couldn't quit crying, and I'm not a crying person. But I didn't want to go. I didn't want to go again, you know.
Yeah.
But
One more
then,
meeting.
of course, that was fine.
She was glad to
did
move
well.
back when we moved back
We
to
did
East.
well. We enjoyed it every place we lived.
You have 2 kids, a son and a daughter.
Yeah, the son and the daughter.
Did either of them go into petroleum or the oil industry
No.
or any kind of work at all?
No.
They didn't want to?
No.
Well,
our
you know,
son-
it was a different day and time. And,
Yeah.
actually, my son-in-law worked for companies that sold equipment into the oil industry. And my son worked on a GSI crew one summer while he was going to college.
And that probably cured it.
Yeah.
That's what I was
Same
getting
mom.
at is, did they look at the schedule or the moving around and decide that that's not for them?
Not
I
our
don't know. I
son.
think he just had different interests. His interest was
Yeah. He
journalism and
yeah,
so
he
forth.
went
He
into
got
journalism and, so that, you know, this didn't.
There's no petroleum journalism, so there's not
No.
much for him to do there in the
No.
oil patch.
No.
He was radio and TV.
No, he was public radio for years, and then he's with the other company now. I'm gonna get y'all either hot coffee or Coke. You have
Coke.
your choice.
Coke is
That,
fine.
that sounds fine with me also.
Got kind of a broad question here, and it might require a little bit of thought. Working for a company, they moved you to lots of different places. You mentioned Canada, where 10 crews moved in. How did your work with the company and the company moving crews into areas, how did that affect the areas that you were moving into? Were you able to hire people from the community to
I guess
actually
in
help
different
work?
ways that this is not a Louisiana example, but it could be. When we moved into this little town in Alberta, as I told you before, it was a town about the size of Sunset, about 2,500 people. They had just made a discovery near that near that town, which was a big discovery at the time, and it really set off a lot of excitement. And so suddenly, there was all this oil activity, not only seismic crews, but there were drilling crews and everything else moving into this little town. Well, it simply overwhelmed that little town. There was no place to live. People were living in basements, and a lot of us bought house trailers and moved house trailers in there eventually. But it was, just really literally almost overwhelmed that town for a while. Of course, the business people loved it. It probably doubled their income. And the other thing too, I mean, this was a farming community. Unemployment was high a good part of the year there, and all of a sudden there were all these jobs available to local people.
Right, these auxiliary positions that can help you
Right,
guys out.
yeah, we hired, we would move in with a kind of a core of a crew, but then we would hire helpers
Local people.
locally. And of course, the drilling companies did the same thing. So when we went in there, you could hire almost anybody in town for $150 a month, but a year later it was probably up to around $350 a month. So the town, that little town, prospered from it, and I'm sure that same thing, I can't describe that same thing happening in Louisiana. Well, I guess I can in a way,
You
because
said you were in some isolated areas
Alma.
too, so.
Houma was a seafood town primarily, and when I first went there and when my wife was growing up there, it was a very small town.
That's his neck of the woods.
Yeah, I'm from Thibodeau actually.
Thibodeau, yeah.
Houma got all the money, and Thibodeau got all the houses, I
And
guess.
the oil industry, the oil industry changed Houma
Dramatically.
terrifically. And Morgan City was a
Yeah.
little fishing town when I first came down there. So there was a tremendous impact from the oil industry on those places.
Would you say more welcome or more not welcome?
Well, there was a mixture. When I first came to Louisiana, the oil industry had been in here for a few years, maybe up to almost 20 years at the time, and there was some kind of oil industry going on here. But we were still looked at as, in the first place, everybody that came in there in the oil industry was a Texan as far as the Cajun was concerned. We were from Texas. If you were a stranger, you were from Texas. And we were looked on with a little bit of suspicion, I guess, during that time. But it didn't last too long. Found out that those jobs were pretty good too. When I was working in the basin area, that's when I got promoted to party chief, and I had a crew of Cajuns from down your area there, around Chack Bay and Kramer, and then that area. Well, they had grown up in the swamp, and shoot, there was nothing to them to take on that swamp out there.
Oh, that place is still a swamp.
When they moved you around a lot, did the company ever provide housing for you? I don't recall.
No.
You had to find it on your own?
Yeah. Basically, I say no. We did live in a company house in England, but that was kind of a strange situation. No, you had to find your own house.
They just told you needed to go there. And
Yeah, go there. Do the best you can.
I asked that
And
because
in fact, in the early days, they paid us a little bit of moving allowance, but it was really small. I mean, it didn't ever cover your expenses. Later on, as time went on, they got better and better at that. So finally, they moved all your furniture and everything else. But in the beginning, you weren't expected to have any furniture or anything like that. We had a little luggage trailer, and you'd rent a furnished apartment and throw everything you had in that luggage trailer. Well,
Did you have to save a lot of money in order to keep moving like that, or was it?
well, you tried.
You tried Did you have to save a lot of money in order to keep moving like that, or was it
Well, you tried.
you tried to? You weren't able to when you were doing that, I guess.
Actually, I can't say we lost a lot of money moving, but the moving allowances weren't too generous. Let's put it that way. When we moved the cheapest possible way. Let's put it that way.
Right.
They'd give you a little mileage for your car and so much a day to eat, and a little bit of about a day or so worth in a hotel or something. So you could look for a place to live, and that was about it.
I wish I would have written down the moving allowances. That's a joke.
What did you mentioned? You had to stay on the boat sometimes out in the Gulf,
Mm-hmm.
and you had quarters on the boats.
Oh yeah, yeah.
What was that like?
They were generally pretty good. In the early days, I used some old shrimp boats and stuff, which weren't too great. But really, during that time, that's when I said they had quarter boats and they would come in. Then they started using they weren't PT boats, but they were wooden vessels similar to PT boats. I forgot what they were called now. There were a lot of those that were surplus from World War II, and very quickly they moved to those vessels, and there would be several vessels on a crew, and each one could sleep probably 9 or 10. They had a little galley and so forth, so they were not terribly uncomfortable.
Was the food good? They had
The food was always good.
Really?
That was the main thing. I mean, if those crews didn't have a good cook, they didn't have a crew very long.
They serve a lot of fish or seafood from what was out there.
Yeah, well, a lot of meat too. I mean,
Wide variety.
yeah.
Was there ever anything that you had a lot of out on the boat that when you came back you wish you could eat when you come back home on land?
Well, this cook that I had when we were in the Chapel Isle Basin, I used to make my wife kind of mad because I'd tell her about his cornbread. He made such good cornbread. So finally she got his cornbread recipe. Another little funny thing that happened there, it's kind of a Cajun experience, I guess. When I had that quarter boat crew over there in the basin, most of the crew was from the Jack Bay, Kramer area. And,
Which is near Thibodeau.
Which
is near Thibodeau.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and we had, but we had a few Texans on the crew too, and. One day I went down and told the cook, I said, hey, we have rice every night. Why can't we once in a while have some potatoes? No, I said, it's no problem. I'll cook. If you want potatoes, I'll cook potatoes. So one night the crew all came in for supper, and there was potatoes, and they all started looking around, well, where's the rice? Where's the rice? And almost had a revolution on my hands. They said, okay, we got to have rice or we quit. One of my first experiences with that guy, with the Cajun diet, I guess.
They wanted to eat the rice versus potatoes.
It is a Cajun
worked hard in the
diet.
field. We had rice every meal.
Every meal.
We had beans almost every meal, some kind of beans.
Good healthy food.
And the food was always
You
good.
had a so-called conservation agent on the boats.
Yeah, the state of Louisiana had these conservation officers that were supposed to be one on each crew when you're working in marsh and swamp and places like that. And they were supposed to monitor, that you didn't blow up big holes in the earth and leave big holes and all that kind of thing, and that you didn't kill any fish and
Oyster
all that.
beds.
And I hate to say it, but it was a racket. Those guys, they're all political appointees, and they could care less about what we did. And
Who paid the salary? The oil company?
well, yeah, the oil company had to pay
Had to pay the
salaries.
Maybe they weren't going to say anything too bad about the oil company.
Oh,
I would assume not.
uh-uh.
That was kind of a big joke.
They
Did,
filled out.
They had to fill out a form every week showing where you had worked and all this kind of stuff. And a lot of them would only show up on the day they had to fill out their form.
Looks like we're doing the wrong job here.
I know, it does.
What about, being that you're not from here, what about, you mentioned the Cajun food, that was the experience. What about language? Did you hear lots of Cajun French with any of the people you were working with?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, you know, those guys that I was talking about there that were on my crew, some of them didn't hardly speak English. And,
There's,
literally, I mean, there were some of them on there that didn't speak English.
there's still people in that area,
Yeah.
Kramer area today, that don't speak English at all. Mostly older people. But
And they also had their own little variety of French, of Cajun French, kind of, because we had people from other areas that would talk with them and they could hardly understand. They didn't communicate too well.
Was that a problem sometimes?
Not really. It wasn't a serious problem.
They had a gambling problem.
oh, really?
Yeah, they would have a Blu-ray game every night on the quarter boat. There was a Blu-ray game going on. And
Card game.
this Texaco representative we had at the time wasn't particularly well liked on the crew. And he thought he was a pretty sharp Blu-ray player. And so he would get into playing Blu-ray with his Cajun. And he'd always lose, and he couldn't figure out why he was always losing. Well, some of those guys were, you know, there was always a bunch playing and another bunch standing around watching. Those guys behind him were yakking away in French all the time. They were telling everybody else what this guy had in his hand.
So he was an outsider.
Yeah, he was a Texan.
So if you were an outsider, they knew
It was
that-
okay. It
yeah.
was fair game.
They treated you okay though. You were.
I always got along
Oh, yeah.
pretty well with that bunch. Of course, I was the boss, and I guess they had to get along
But-
with me.
But you had to shut the gamblers down because
Yeah, well,
they would
really.
lose their salary.
Yeah, there
Before
was
they
two.
went
That
home.
got to be
Yeah, so that
a
was
bad
it.
thing on that boat, and I finally told them no more Blu-ray.
So you said they had a gambling problem. Did they also have any other problems like alcohol or drugs? Any of them?
No, I don't. We never had a drug problem. Never had a drug problem, and very little alcohol problem.
Well, they didn't take alcohol. They weren't
Well,
allowed.
no, we didn't
No.
buy alcohol on the boat, but I'm just talking about, you know,
Oh,
we didn't have a
yeah.
lot of guys showing up on
Oh,
first day
there
out
weren't-
drunk or
there-
something like that.
there were no such things as drugs.
And you know, the whole time,
Yeah.
I was
It was
doodle-bugging,
unknown.
until, you know, the very last years, I never knew of a drug problem. I mean, that happened within that happened from the
Recent.
70s on, pretty
Yeah.
much.
When you cut out the Blu-ray, did you have a mutiny on your hands?
No, I think some of them were kind of waiting for somebody to say, I don't, you ought not to do this anymore.
Especially when you get home without a paycheck.
Yeah. So you were doing them a favor. They just didn't realize it right away.
Oh, I had some grumbling about it, but nothing very serious. I'm kind of running out of stories.
Then you
Yeah,
go,
that's pretty much all.
yeah, I
we
think
have.
so.
I didn't know you were such a storyteller.
We've got some,
Well, you heard all those stories before.
Yeah, but I heard them one at a time.
Not all at once in one sitting.
We
And you-
used to have a rule when we had a party on the crew that the men, we were sick and tired of it. They'd work all day long together, and then that's what they'd talk about at night when we'd all have a party. So we said, you had to, how did that go? What was the
Somebody at
rule?
one
You had a
part,
little bitty-
somebody had a little end table about that high, and they
Yeah.
put a sign on it that said, everybody that wants to talk about doodle bugging, please get under the
Had
table.
to get under the table. We wouldn't allow it. I mean,
I don't know if I told you, we were called doodle buggers. I don't know if you're
No, I
familiar with that
never heard that one.
term. Well, it came about from the old well dowsers, you know, the guys that went around with these sticks,
Yeah.
and they were kind of like these little doodle bugs that have the antennas that go up and down, and so I guess that they look something like that. And so they started calling them back in the early years, many years ago, I don't know how long, they started calling those well dowsers doodle buggers. Well, when we started out, we were kind of a black magic bunch too. We're out there looking for something under the ground like those well dowsers, and so we got the name doodle buggers, and that's what we were called.
Was that what, is that on your website?
Mm.
Wow.
That's good. I haven't heard of that.
And you have a website?
Yeah, sort of. It's not very up to date anymore.
I
I
know the
worked at it
feeling.
for a while, but I don't work at it too much anymore.
We'll check it out.
Yeah.
And he sent me to the other. I'll show it to you when we get back
Okay.
to the place. There's a in Society of Geophysical Engineers.
Oh, okay.
I think that's about it.
Good.
If we could maybe just get
What do you need?
from this.
Okay.
Okay.
It's all digital.
It's
These
a
things are
little
amazing.
cannon. Oh,
Yeah. Okay, there we go.
okay.
Yeah.
That's a needle.
Ooh.